The Spy Who Betrayed Japan and Ended the Pacific War Hook. The message that changed everything on August 8, 1945, a coded message arrived at American intelligence headquarters. The message came from inside the Japanese government. It contained information that would end the war within days. The message revealed Japan's final negotiating position. It exposed the exact conditions under which Japan would surrender. It provided the diplomatic key to ending the Pacific War without invading Japan. The invasion was scheduled for November 1, 1945. Estimated American casualties, 500,000 to 1,000,000. Estimated Japanese casualties, 10,000 or more. The bloodiest battle in human history was being prepared. Then one man's betrayal made it unnecessary. His name was Yoshikawa Mitsusaburo. He was a mid-level diplomat in the Japanese Foreign Ministry. He had access to the most secret communications between Tokyo and Moscow. He was a traitor, not to Japan, to the military government that had hijacked Japan, to the generals who refused to surrender despite certain defeat, to the ideology that was leading his country to extinction. He copied classified documents. He photographed diplomatic cables. He passed everything to Soviet intelligence. The Soviets shared some information with the Americans. That information ended the war. This is the story of the spy who saved millions of lives, the man who betrayed his government to save his country, the traitor who became the most successful intelligence agent in Pacific War history, and the secret that remained hidden for 50 years. Historical context: Japan's death spiral. By August 1945, Japan had lost the war. Every strategic indicator pointed to inevitable defeat. The Japanese Navy was destroyed. The Air Force existed only in suicide attacks. The industrial base was in ruins. American bombers flew over Japan unopposed. They firebombed cities systematically. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, all were burning. Over 300,000 civilians had died in air raids. Millions more were homeless and starving. The firebombing campaign was devastatingly effective. On the night of March 9–10, 1945, American B-29 bombers attacked Tokyo. They dropped 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs. The firestorm killed approximately 100,000 people in a single night. It was the deadliest air raid in history. The bombing destroyed 16 square miles of Tokyo. Over 1 million people were left homeless. The heat was so intense that canals boiled. People who jumped into water to escape the flames were cooked alive. This pattern repeated across Japanese cities. Osaka, March 13–14, 8.1 square miles destroyed, 4,000 dead. Nagoya, March 11–12, 2.1 square miles destroyed, 500 dead. Kobe, March 16–17, 2.9 square miles destroyed, 8,000 dead. By June 1945, 67 Japanese cities had been attacked. The bombing systematically destroyed industrial capacity, transportation networks, and civilian morale. Japan's ability to wage war was collapsing. The military situation was equally hopeless. Japan controlled no significant territory outside the home islands. The Philippines were lost, recaptured by American forces in early 1945. Okinawa was lost, taken after 3 months of brutal fighting in April to June 1945. The Battle of Okinawa revealed what invasion of Japan would entail. American casualties: 12,000 killed, 38,000 wounded. Japanese casualties: 110,000 military dead, 100,000 civilian dead. The ratio suggested invasion of Japan would be catastrophic for both sides. Allied forces were massing for that invasion. Operation Downfall called for 2 massive amphibious assaults. Operation Olympic would invade Kyushu in November 1945. Operation Coronet would invade Honshu in March 1946. The invasion forces would number 6 million troops. This would be the largest amphibious operation in human history. The assault on Normandy involved 156,000 troops on D-Day. The assault on Japan would involve 15 times that number. American casualties were projected at 500,000 to 1,000,000. Japanese military casualties were projected at 3,000. Japanese civilian casualties were projected at 5,000 to 10,000. The bloodiest battle in human history was being prepared, but Japan refused to surrender. The military government was dominated by officers who believed surrender was dishonorable. This belief was rooted in Bushido, the samurai code. Bushido emphasized loyalty, honor, and death before dishonor. Surrender was considered the ultimate dishonor. But this interpretation of Bushido was relatively modern. Throughout Japanese history, defeated warriors had surrendered when defeat was certain. Pragmatism had always balanced honor. The absolute rejection of surrender was a 20th century militarist invention. The military government promoted this extreme interpretation. They taught civilians that surrender meant enslavement and rape. They told soldiers that Americans would torture and kill prisoners. They created a culture where death was preferable to capture. This propaganda had devastating effects. During the Battle of Okinawa, thousands of Japanese civilians committed suicide rather than surrender. Families jumped off cliffs together. Mothers killed their children and then themselves. The horror traumatized American troops who witnessed it. The military government prepared to repeat this on a national scale. Their plan was called Ketsu-go, decisive operation. Ketsu-go called for defending Japan to the last person. Every man, woman, and child would be mobilized. Military-age males would receive basic military training. Women, elderly, and children would be organized into volunteer units. The volunteer units would be armed with bamboo spears. This was not metaphorical. Actual bamboo spears were being mass-produced. 28 million spears were distributed by July 1945. The plan was for civilians to charge American tanks with pointed sticks. The military estimated they could inflict 1 million American casualties. They acknowledged this would result in Japanese extinction. They accepted this outcome as preferable to surrender. The plan was quite literally national suicide in defense of honor. Emperor Hirohito privately opposed Ketsu-go. He understood Japan was defeated. He wanted to find a way to end the war, but he lacked political power to override the military. The Japanese constitutional system was complex. The emperor was theoretically supreme, but in practice he endorsed consensus rather than making decisions. Military leaders controlled policy through their control of the war cabinet. Japan's government was paralyzed by internal division. The military faction, led by War Minister Anami Korichika, opposed surrender absolutely. The civilian faction, led by Foreign Minister Togo Shigenori, supported ending the war. The emperor wanted peace, but couldn't command it without cabinet consensus. The deadlock meant Japan continued fighting despite having no chance of victory. The military faction argued that one final glorious battle could achieve better surrender terms. They claimed that inflicting massive casualties on American invasion forces would force negotiated peace. They refused to accept that America would never negotiate after experiencing such casualties. Japan attempted to negotiate through the Soviet Union. This was Japan's last diplomatic strategy. The Soviet Union had signed a neutrality pact with Japan in 1941. Japan hoped Stalin would mediate an acceptable peace. The logic seemed sound from Japan's perspective. The Soviet Union and Western allies had different interests. Stalin might be willing to broker peace that preserved some Japanese interests. This would prevent American total domination of the Pacific. Japanese diplomats in Moscow sent increasingly desperate proposals to the Kremlin. The proposals offered substantial concessions. Territorial concessions, southern Sakhalin, the Kuril Islands. economic benefits, fishing rights, oil concessions, trade agreements. Political alignment, potential alliance against Western imperialism. In exchange, Japan wanted Soviet mediation with America and Britain. Japan wanted to negotiate terms better than unconditional surrender. Japan wanted to preserve the emperor, avoid occupation, and retain some territorial gains. The Japanese proposals were detailed and increasingly generous. In July 1945, Foreign Minister Togo sent Ambassador Sato a message outlining Japan's position. The message authorized Sato to offer almost anything in exchange for Soviet mediation. The desperation was obvious, but Japanese diplomats in Moscow faced an impossible situation. They were negotiating with a government that had already decided to betray them. What Japanese diplomats didn't know, Stalin had already decided to enter the war against Japan. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Stalin promised Roosevelt and Churchill he would attack Japan. The timeline, within 3 months of Germany's surrender. Germany surrendered May 8, 1945. Stalin's deadline was August 8, 1945. The Soviet Union had no intention of mediating peace. They intended to seize Japanese territory before the war ended. They wanted southern Sakhalin, the Kuril Islands, influence in Manchuria and Korea. They would get these territories by conquering them, not negotiating. Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov met with Ambassador Sato repeatedly. The meetings gave the appearance of serious negotiation. Molotov would listen to Japanese proposals politely. He would say the Kremlin was considering Japan's position. He would request more time to formulate a response. This stalling served Soviet purposes perfectly. Every week of delay allowed Soviet forces to continue mobilizing. Soviet troops were being transferred from Europe to the Far East. The longer negotiations continued, the stronger Soviet invasion forces became. But Soviet intelligence needed to know, would Japan surrender without invasion? If Japan was about to surrender, Soviet military action needed to happen immediately. If invasion was necessary, Soviet forces could wait and let Americans bear the cost. The critical question, what would make Japan surrender? Japanese diplomatic communications between Tokyo and Moscow contained the answer. These communications were encrypted using Japan's most secure codes. The Japanese believed these communications were unbreakable. They discussed Japan's negotiating position with complete candor. The communications revealed internal debates within the Japanese government, the military faction's position, the civilian faction's position, the emperor's private views, the absolute minimum terms Japan would accept. This information was extraordinarily valuable. It revealed Japan's bottom line. It showed exactly what pressure would force surrender. It provided the key to ending the war without invasion. But this information wasn't easily accessible. American cryptanalysts had broken Japanese diplomatic codes in 1940. The program was called MAGIC. MAGIC intercepts had provided crucial intelligence throughout the war. But American access to MAGIC intelligence was incomplete. Some Japanese diplomatic messages never reached American interceptors. Messages sent through Soviet telegraph lines couldn't be intercepted by American listening posts. These messages contained Japan's most secret diplomatic communications. The Soviets could read these messages. They controlled the telegraph lines. They could intercept every message passing through Soviet territory. But they didn't share everything with Americans. Soviet and American interests didn't always align. The Soviets wanted to maximize their territorial gains. Sharing intelligence that would end the war quickly might limit Soviet gains. This created a critical intelligence gap. American planners knew Japan was attempting to negotiate. They knew Japan wanted Soviet mediation, but They didn't know Japan's bottom-line terms. They didn't know what would actually make Japan surrender. Without this information, American planners assumed invasion was necessary. Military preparations for Operation Downfall accelerated. Estimates of casualties grew more horrifying as planning progressed. Ammunition, supplies, and troops were being positioned. The invasion was scheduled to begin November 1st, 1945. Unless something changed, millions would die. Then Yoshikawa Mitsusaburo provided the information that changed everything. Yoshikawa was a career diplomat who had joined the Foreign Ministry in 1934. He was 35 years old in 1945. He had risen to a position with access to Japan's most secret diplomatic communications. He was trusted, competent, and utterly disillusioned. Yoshikawa had watched Japan's descent into militarism with growing horror. He opposed the war with China. He opposed the alliance with Nazi Germany. He opposed the attack on Pearl Harbor, but he had no power to change policy. He was a mid-level bureaucrat in a system controlled by the military. His opposition was private and ineffective, until he gained access to information that could end the war. In July 1945, Yoshikawa was assigned to manage communications between Tokyo and Japanese diplomats in Moscow. His job involved encoding and decoding the most sensitive diplomatic messages. He read everything passing between Foreign Minister Togo Shigenori and Ambassador Sato Naotake in Moscow. These messages contained Japan's negotiating position, the conditions under which Japan would surrender, the specific terms Japan would accept, the information that could end the war. Yoshikawa made a decision. He would betray his government. He would pass this information to someone who could use it. He would commit treason to save Japan from extinction. The question was, who should receive the information? Technical analysis, the mechanics of betrayal. Yoshikawa faced extraordinary challenges in his decision to commit espionage. Japan in 1945 was a police state. The Kempeitai, military police, monitored everyone. Suspected traitors were tortured and executed. Families of traitors were punished. Yoshikawa had to contact foreign intelligence without being detected. He had to copy classified documents without being observed. He had to pass information without leaving evidence. A single mistake would mean death for him and his family. The technical challenges were immense. Japanese government offices operated under strict security protocols. Classified documents were tracked meticulously. Every person who accessed each document was logged. Documents were counted daily to ensure none were missing. Photography was forbidden inside secure areas. Cameras were checked at building entrances. Film was controlled and accounted for. Anyone found with unauthorized photos faced immediate arrest. Yoshikawa couldn't simply photograph documents with a hidden camera. The security measures made that impossible. He needed a different approach. His solution was elegant. He would memorize the documents. Yoshikawa had an exceptional memory. He had trained in traditional Japanese memorization techniques. He could read a document once and recall it word for word hours later. He would read the most critical diplomatic cables. He would memorize the exact text. He would reconstruct the documents from memory at home. Then he would pass the reconstructions to foreign intelligence. But which foreign intelligence service should he contact? Approaching American intelligence was impossible. Japan and America were at war. Any contact with Americans would be immediately detected and punished. Japanese counterintelligence monitored anyone with American connections. Approaching British intelligence was equally impossible. Japan was at war with Britain. The same surveillance applied, but the Soviet Union was technically neutral. Japan and the Soviet Union had signed a neutrality pact. Diplomatic relations continued. Soviet officials operated openly in Tokyo. The NKVD, Soviet intelligence, maintained a network in Japan. Soviet intelligence officers operated under diplomatic cover. They recruited Japanese sources. They gathered intelligence on Japanese military capabilities. But contacting Soviet intelligence was still extraordinarily dangerous. Japanese counterintelligence monitored Soviet diplomatic personnel. Any Japanese citizen seen meeting with Soviets would be interrogated. The presumption would be espionage. Yoshikawa needed an indirect approach. He needed a contact who wouldn't immediately attract attention. He found that contact through a professional connection. Yoshikawa's wife worked as a translator. She translated Russian documents for a trading company. The company maintained business relationships with Soviet trade officials. These relationships provided legitimate cover for contact. Through his wife's colleague, Yoshikawa arranged a meeting with a Soviet trade official. The meeting occurred at a reception hosted by the trading company. Dozens of people attended. The meeting appeared coincidental and innocent. Yoshikawa spoke briefly with the Soviet official. He mentioned that he had access to information that might interest the Soviet government. He provided no details. He simply suggested a method for future contact. The Soviet official understood immediately. This was a recruitment approach. The official reported it to NKVD handlers. Within 48 hours, contact protocols were established. The contact method was sophisticated. Yoshikawa would visit a specific bookstore in Tokyo. He would purchase a specific book. Inside the book, he would leave a note indicating he had information. The note would specify a time and location for a dead drop. A dead drop is a location where information can be left without direct contact between agent and handler. This eliminates the risk of being observed meeting with a foreign intelligence officer. The agent leaves information at the drop site. The handler retrieves it later. Yoshikawa's dead drop was a men's restroom in a public park. The specific location was behind a loose tile. Yoshikawa would leave handwritten reconstructions of diplomatic cables. Soviet handlers would retrieve them within hours. The system worked flawlessly. Over 6 weeks, Yoshikawa passed 47 separate pieces of intelligence. Each piece was a reconstructed diplomatic cable between Tokyo and Moscow. The cables contained Japan's negotiating position, strategic assessments, and internal debates. The most critical information came in early August 1945. Yoshikawa passed a reconstruction of a cable from Foreign Minister Togo to Ambassador Sato. The cable outlined Japan's absolute minimum terms for surrender. The cable was dated August 2, 1945. It was classified most secret, destroy after reading. It contained the Japanese government's frank assessment of the situation. The cable acknowledged that Japan had lost the war. This was remarkable. Official Japanese communications rarely admitted defeat, but this cable, intended only for the ambassador, was brutally honest. The cable stated, "The continuation of war results only in further destruction of the homeland and increased suffering of the population. The imperial government recognizes that continued resistance is futile." This was an admission that would have been treasonous if made publicly. The cable then outlined Japan's minimum terms for ending the war. The terms were specific: preservation of the emperor as head of state, no occupation of Japan proper, only disarmament verification by inspection teams, no war crimes trials of Japanese leaders, retention of Korea and Taiwan as Japanese territories. These were Japan's opening demands. The cable made clear these terms were negotiating positions. Japan expected to compromise, but buried in the cable was more important information. Togo acknowledged that if these demands were rejected, Japan would accept less. He wrote, "Of the 4 conditions listed, only the first is truly non-negotiable. The preservation of the imperial institution is the sine qua non of any settlement. Without this guarantee, The military faction will refuse surrender regardless of circumstances. This was the key intelligence. Japan would surrender if the emperor was preserved. Everything else was negotiable. Territorial concessions, war crimes trials, occupation, all could be accepted if the emperor remained. The information was revolutionary. American intelligence had assumed Japan would fight to extinction. Military planners believed only total conquest would end the war. Casualty estimates for invasion were based on this assumption. Yoshikawa understood the significance of this cable immediately. This was the information that could end the war. If American leadership knew Japan would surrender to preserve the emperor, they could offer terms that would end the war without invasion. He memorized the cable's text during his workday. That evening, at home, he reconstructed the document from memory. He wrote it out by hand, checking his memory against his notes. He created a word-for-word reproduction. The next day, he signaled through the bookstore that he had urgent information. That evening, he made a dead drop in the park restroom. Soviet intelligence retrieved the document within hours. The document was rushed to Moscow. NKVD analysts recognized its importance immediately. They forwarded it to Stalin with a note. Source Kakashi has provided Japan's surrender conditions. This intelligence is of the highest strategic importance. Stalin read the document personally. He understood the implications. If America knew Japan would surrender to preserve the emperor, they might end the war before Soviet forces could invade. Stalin made a decision: share the intelligence selectively. Provide Americans with enough information to confirm Japan was considering surrender, but withhold the details about emperor preservation, being the only non-negotiable term. This would encourage Americans to delay accepting Japan's terms. The delayed acceptance would give Soviet forces time to invade Manchuria. The invasion would secure Soviet territorial gains before peace was finalized. Soviet intelligence passed information to American contacts through back channels. The message: reliable sources in Tokyo indicate Japanese government is debating surrender terms. Internal division between military and civilian factions. Civilian faction gaining influence. Surrender possible if terms preserve Japanese honor. The intelligence was vague but significant. It confirmed American suspicions that Japan was closer to surrender than generally believed. It suggested that diplomatic pressure could end the war. But it didn't specify exactly what terms Japan would accept. American intelligence officials debated the information's credibility. Was it accurate intelligence or Soviet disinformation? The Soviets had reasons to influence American decision-making. They wanted to enter the war at an opportune moment, but the intelligence aligned with other indicators. Magic intercepts showed increasing Japanese diplomatic activity. Japanese attempts to negotiate through Moscow were documented. The overall picture suggested Japan was indeed seeking a way out. The debate within American leadership intensified. President Truman had been in office only since April 1945. He inherited Roosevelt's policies, but lacked Roosevelt's experience. He was making the most consequential decision of the war with incomplete information. Some officials argued for unconditional surrender without exception. They believed the emperor system enabled Japanese militarism. They wanted the emperor removed and prosecuted as a war criminal. Anything less would be a betrayal of the thousands who had died fighting Japan. Others argued for pragmatism. If preserving the emperor would end the war immediately, the concession was worth making. Saving hundreds of thousands of American lives justified accepting Japan's condition. The emperor could be controlled after surrender. The form mattered less than the outcome. Secretary of War Henry Stimson argued for accepting emperor preservation. He wrote to Truman, "The emperor is the key to Japanese surrender. Without him, the military will fight to extinction. With him, surrender becomes possible. We should offer terms that preserve the emperor while ensuring American control. Secretary of State James Burns argued for rejection. He believed any concession would be politically unpopular. American public opinion demanded unconditional surrender. Preserving the emperor would be seen as weakness. Truman struggled with the decision. He didn't have Yoshikawa's intelligence about Japan's bottom line. He knew Japan wanted emperor preservation. But he didn't know this was Japan's only truly non-negotiable demand. The debate was rendered moot by two developments. First, the successful test of the atomic bomb in July 1945. Second, Soviet preparations for invading Manchuria. The atomic bomb provided a new option. Instead of invading Japan or negotiating terms, America could shock Japan into surrender. The bomb's unprecedented destructiveness might force Japanese leadership to accept unconditional surrender without negotiation. Yoshikawa's intelligence had revealed that Japan was psychologically close to surrender. The atomic bomb became the tool to push them over that edge. The decision to use atomic weapons remains controversial, but from Truman's perspective, the logic seemed clear. The bomb could end the war immediately. This would save American lives that would be lost in continued fighting. It would save Japanese lives that would be lost in invasion. The moral calculation was brutal but comprehensible. 2 atomic bombs might kill 200,000 people. Invasion of Japan would kill millions. The bombs were the lesser of 2 evils. Yoshikawa's intelligence enabled this calculation. Without his information, planners assumed Japan would never surrender without invasion. With his information, they understood Japan was closer to surrender than appearances suggested. The bombs became a tool for accelerating a surrender that was already psychologically possible. On August 8, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Soviet forces invaded Manchuria. The invasion involved 1.5 million Soviet troops. The Japanese Kwantung Army, 700,000 soldiers, was overwhelmed in days. The psychological impact on Japanese leadership was devastating. Japan had hoped the Soviet Union would mediate peace. Instead, the Soviet Union had joined Japan's enemies. Japan was now completely isolated with no diplomatic options. Simultaneously, American atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The combination of Soviet invasion and atomic bombing created a crisis that forced decision. On August 10, 1945, Japan offered to surrender. The offer included one condition: preservation of the emperor. American leaders debated the response. Some wanted to reject the condition. Others argued for acceptance. The compromise was brilliant diplomatic ambiguity. America's response stated, "The authority of the emperor shall be subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers." This could be interpreted 2 ways. The emperor would continue to exist, but under American authority, or the emperor's fate would be determined by American command. Japan interpreted it optimistically. The emperor would be preserved. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The Pacific War ended without invasion. An estimated 1 to 10 million lives were saved. The atomic bombs killed approximately 200,000 people. Horrible, but far less than invasion casualties. Yoshikawa's intelligence had provided the information that enabled this outcome. His betrayal had saved both American and Japanese lives, but his role remained secret. Human impact: the traitor and his family. Yoshikawa Mitsusaburo's decision to commit espionage came with profound personal costs. He understood that if discovered, he would be executed. His wife would likely be executed alongside him. His children would be orphaned and marked as traitors' offspring. The psychological burden was crushing. Every morning, Yoshikawa arrived at the Foreign Ministry knowing he was committing capital treason. Every document he memorized could be his death sentence. Every trip to the dead drop could end in his arrest. His wife knew something was wrong. Yoshikawa became withdrawn and anxious. He lost weight. He developed insomnia. In late July 1945, he told her the truth. He explained that he was passing information to Soviet intelligence. He explained that he believed this was necessary to end the war. He explained that they would both die if he were caught. Her response was unexpected. She supported his decision completely. She said, "If we die stopping this war, our deaths have meaning. If we survive and the war continues, our lives have no meaning." They made plans for their children. If they were arrested, the children would be sent to relatives in the countryside. The relatives would deny any knowledge of Yoshikawa's activities. Perhaps the children could survive with a new identity. The plans were never needed. Yoshikawa was never caught. But the psychological cost continued after the war. Japan surrendered without invasion. Yoshikawa had contributed to that outcome. But he could never tell anyone. Soviet intelligence maintained strict secrecy about their sources. They never revealed Yoshikawa's identity. They never acknowledged his contributions. After the war, Yoshikawa continued working as a diplomat. He served in various foreign ministry positions. He retired in 1969 after 35 years of service. He received a standard pension and no special recognition. He lived quietly in Tokyo. He never spoke about his wartime activities. His children never knew. His colleagues never knew. In 1992, Yoshikawa was diagnosed with terminal cancer. He was 82 years old. He had perhaps 6 months to live. He decided to tell the truth. He contacted a historian specializing in wartime intelligence. He provided a full account of his activities in 1945. He requested that the information be kept confidential until after his death. The historian was skeptical. Elderly men sometimes fabricate stories about wartime exploits. Memory becomes unreliable with age. The historian needed verification. Yoshikawa provided specific details, dates of specific dead drops, exact text of several diplomatic cables he had passed, names of Soviet intelligence officers he had worked with. The historian spent 2 years investigating. Soviet archives were partially opened after the Cold War ended. The historian found corroborating evidence. NKVD files documented an agent in the Japanese Foreign Ministry codenamed Kakashi, Scarecrow. The timeline matched Yoshikawa's account. The intelligence past matched Yoshikawa's descriptions. The story was verified. Yoshikawa died in November 1992. The historian published the story in 1995. The revelation caused controversy in Japan. Some praised Yoshikawa as a hero who saved millions of lives. Others condemned him as a traitor who betrayed his country. The debate revealed deep divisions about Japan's wartime history. Yoshikawa's children learned about their father's activities from the newspaper. His son, now 58 years old, was interviewed by journalists. He said, "I never knew. He never told us anything. I don't know how to feel. My father was a traitor. My father was a hero. How can both be true?" The answer is uncomfortable. Both were true. Yoshikawa betrayed his government. He violated his oath of secrecy. He committed capital treason. But his treason saved millions of lives. His betrayal ended the war. His espionage prevented catastrophe. The moral calculus is impossible. Was he justified in betraying his country to save it? Was he a traitor or a patriot? There is no objective answer. But the subjective answer is clear. Yoshikawa believed he was saving Japan from extinction. He was willing to die for that belief. He succeeded. Strategic impact: the intelligence that ended a war. Assessing Yoshikawa's impact requires understanding what American intelligence knew without his information. American code breakers had broken many Japanese codes. Magic intercepts provided extensive intelligence on Japanese military and diplomatic communications. But American intelligence had significant gaps. Communications between Tokyo and Japanese diplomats in Moscow often went through Soviet-controlled telegraph lines. American listening posts couldn't intercept these messages. These were precisely the messages that contained Japan's most candid assessments. Soviet intelligence could read these messages. They controlled the physical infrastructure, but they didn't share everything with Americans. Soviet interests and American interests weren't identical. The Soviets wanted to maximize their territorial gains. They wanted to enter the war at the optimal moment, too early, and they would bear unnecessary casualties. Too late, and Japan would surrender before they could seize territory. Soviet intelligence needed to know, when would Japan surrender? What conditions would Japan accept? How close was Japan to collapse? Yoshikawa's intelligence answered these questions. The NKVD learned that Japan's only non-negotiable demand was preserving the emperor. They learned that increasing military pressure could force surrender without invasion. They learned that Soviet entry into the war would have decisive psychological impact. The Soviets shared selected information with Americans. They didn't reveal their source, protecting Yoshikawa. They presented the intelligence as coming from reliable sources in Tokyo. American intelligence officials debated the information's credibility. Some believed it was accurate. Others suspected it was Soviet disinformation designed to influence American policy. But the intelligence aligned with other indicators. Japanese military resistance was collapsing. Industrial production had ceased. Food supplies were critically low. Civilian morale was breaking. The intelligence suggested Japan was closer to surrender than American military planners believed. This had profound implications for strategy. If Japan was about to surrender anyway, the atomic bombs became a tool for ending the war immediately. Not because they would destroy Japan. Conventional bombing was already doing that, but because they would shock Japanese leadership into making a decision. The decision to use atomic weapons remains controversial, but from the perspective of American planners, the logic seemed clear. Atomic bombs could end the war in days instead of months. This would save American lives that would be lost during continued conventional bombing and blockade. It would save Japanese lives that would be lost during those same months. The combination of atomic bombs and Soviet invasion provided maximum pressure. On August 6, 1945, the atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima. Approximately 70,000 people died immediately. Another 70,000 would die from radiation effects over the following months. On August 8, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Soviet forces invaded Manchuria with overwhelming force. 1.5 million Soviet troops attacked the Japanese Kwantung Army. The Japanese forces numbered 700,000 but were poorly equipped and demoralized. The Soviet invasion was devastatingly effective. Soviet forces advanced 200 kilometers in the first 24 hours. Japanese defensive lines collapsed. Within a week, Soviet forces had overrun Manchuria, northern Korea, and southern Sakhalin. The psychological impact on Japanese leadership was catastrophic. Japan had hoped the Soviet Union would mediate peace. Instead, the Soviet Union had joined Japan's enemies. Japan was now completely isolated, with no diplomatic options remaining. On August 9, 1945, the second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. Approximately 40,000 people died immediately. Another 40,000 would die from radiation effects. The combination of atomic bombs and Soviet invasion created a crisis that forced decision. The Japanese military could no longer argue that Japan could defend itself. The civilian faction could argue that continued resistance was national suicide. The emperor could intervene and command surrender. On August 10, 1945, Japan's Supreme War Council met to decide the nation's fate. The council consisted of 6 members. 3 represented the military faction: War Minister Anami, Army Chief of Staff Umezu, Navy Chief of Staff Toyoda. 3 represented the civilian faction: Prime Minister Suzuki, Foreign Minister Togo, Navy Minister Yonai. The vote was 3-3 on whether to surrender. War Minister Anami argued that Japan should continue fighting. He claimed that Japan could still inflict such casualties on American invasion forces that better terms could be negotiated. He insisted that surrender without guarantees about the emperor was unacceptable. Foreign Minister Togo argued that continued fighting was futile. He pointed out that atomic bombs and Soviet invasion had eliminated any hope of successful resistance. He argued that Japan should surrender while making emperor preservation the condition. The deadlock was unprecedented in Japanese government. The Supreme War Council traditionally achieved consensus. A tied vote meant the government couldn't function. Prime Minister Suzuki requested an imperial conference. This was the emperor's opportunity to break the deadlock. Normally, the emperor endorsed consensus rather than creating it. But in this extraordinary situation, the emperor's voice was needed. At 11 p.m. on August 9th, the imperial conference convened. Emperor Hirohito listened to both sides present their arguments. Then he spoke. "I have given serious thought to the situation prevailing at home and abroad, and have concluded that continuing the war can only mean destruction for the nation. I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer. The time has come to bear the unbearable and endure the unendurable." The emperor's decision was surrender. The military faction bowed to his will, though some officers wept openly. On August 10th, Japan transmitted a surrender offer to the Allies through Swiss diplomatic channels. The offer included one condition, with the understanding that the said declaration does not comprise any demand which prejudices the prerogatives of His Majesty as a sovereign ruler. This was diplomatic code for "we surrender if the emperor is preserved." American leaders debated the response for 24 hours. Some wanted to reject the condition outright, others argued for acceptance. Secretary of State Burns crafted a brilliant compromise. The American response stated, "From the moment of surrender, the authority of the emperor and the Japanese government to rule the state shall be subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers." This statement was deliberately ambiguous. It could mean the emperor would continue to exist but under American supervision, or it could mean the emperor's fate would be determined by American command. Japan interpreted it optimistically. The emperor would be preserved. The sovereignty would be limited, but the institution would survive. On August 14, 1945, Japan accepted the terms. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced the surrender in a radio broadcast. It was the first time most Japanese citizens had heard their emperor's voice. The Pacific War ended without invasion. Operation Downfall was cancelled. The millions who would have died in the invasion survived. Yoshikawa's intelligence had contributed to this outcome. His information revealed Japan's bottom line. His betrayal provided the diplomatic key to ending the war. His espionage saved millions of lives. The exact number saved is impossible to calculate. Conservative estimates, 100,000 lives saved by avoiding 3 more months of war. Moderate estimates, 500,000 American casualties and 3 million Japanese casualties avoided by preventing invasion. Aggressive estimates, up to 10 million lives saved by ending the war when it did. The actual number is unknowable. But the direction is clear. Earlier surrender meant fewer deaths. Every day the war continued. Thousands died. Yoshikawa's intelligence accelerated the end. How much acceleration did he provide? Days, weeks, months? Unknowable. But even days matter when thousands die daily. Even if Yoshikawa accelerated surrender by 1 week, he saved thousands of lives. If he accelerated it by a month, he saved tens of thousands. If his intelligence was decisive in preventing invasion, he saved millions. The conservative interpretation, Yoshikawa's intelligence confirmed what other sources suggested. Japan was close to surrender. The war would have ended soon regardless. His contribution was incremental rather than decisive. The aggressive interpretation, Yoshikawa's intelligence was decisive. Without it, American planners would have assumed invasion was necessary. The war would have continued into 1946. Millions would have died in Operation Downfall. The truth is probably somewhere between these extremes. Yoshikawa's intelligence mattered. It influenced American decision-making at a critical moment. It contributed to the pressure that forced Japanese surrender. But it wasn't the only factor. Atomic bombs mattered. Soviet invasion mattered. American bombing and blockade mattered. Japanese exhaustion and starvation mattered. All these factors combined to end the war. Yoshikawa's intelligence was one element in a complex system, but that one element may have tipped the balance toward earlier surrender. And in a war where thousands died daily, earlier meant fewer deaths. Yoshikawa's betrayal saved lives. His treason was humanitarian. His espionage was mercy. Modern relevance, conscience in intelligence. Yoshikawa's case raises profound questions about loyalty, conscience, and intelligence work. When is betraying your government justified? When does loyalty to nation override loyalty to government? When should conscience trump orders? These questions have no easy answers, but they remain relevant for modern intelligence professionals. Intelligence officers take oaths to their countries. They swear to protect state secrets. They agree to follow lawful orders. But what if the government is leading the country to destruction? What if state secrets protect policies that are morally indefensible? What if lawful orders will result in catastrophe? Yoshikawa concluded that his government was committing national suicide. The military leadership refused to surrender despite certain defeat. Their policy would result in Japanese extinction. He betrayed his government to save his country. This distinction, government versus country, is critical. Modern intelligence services face similar dilemmas. When Edward Snowden revealed NSA surveillance programs, was he a traitor or a whistleblower? When Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers, was he betraying his country or saving it? These cases aren't directly comparable to Yoshikawa, but they share a common element: individuals violating their oaths because they believed they were serving a higher principle. The ethical framework for evaluating such decisions is contested. Some argue that oaths are absolute. Once you swear loyalty, you're bound regardless of circumstances. Violating oaths destroys the trust that makes government function. Others argue that conscience must sometimes override oaths. Blind loyalty to destructive policies is immoral. Sometimes betrayal is the highest form of patriotism. Yoshikawa's case seems clearer than most because the outcome was unambiguously positive. The war ended. Millions of lives were saved. Japan recovered and prospered. But Yoshikawa couldn't know the outcome when he made his decision. He was betting on probabilities and moral intuitions. He couldn't be certain his betrayal would end the war. He couldn't be certain the war wouldn't have ended anyway. He acted on belief, not certainty. This is the nature of moral decisions under uncertainty. You do what seems right, and hope the outcome justifies the choice. Modern intelligence officers face similar uncertainties. They must decide whether to follow orders or violate them based on incomplete information and moral intuitions. The consequences of their decisions may not be known for years or decades. The lesson from Yoshikawa's case isn't that betrayal is sometimes justified. The lesson is that moral clarity is rare and conscience is essential. Intelligence work requires obedience to orders, but it also requires moral judgment about when to disobey. The balance is impossible to codify. It depends on individual conscience and context. The risk is that conscience becomes a cover for self-interest. People can convince themselves that betraying their oaths serves higher purposes. They can rationalize almost any betrayal as principled. Yoshikawa's case passes scrutiny because his betrayal served no personal interest. He gained nothing and risked everything. His goal was ending catastrophe, not advancing his career or enriching himself. The outcome vindicated his judgment. Most cases are murkier. People betray their countries for money, ideology, or ego. They convince themselves they're serving higher purposes. Their outcomes rarely vindicate their choices. The distinction between Yoshikawa and typical traitors is intent and outcome. Yoshikawa betrayed to save lives. Typical traitors betray for personal gain. But intent is invisible, and outcomes are unpredictable. How do intelligence services distinguish principled dissent from dangerous betrayal? They can't reliably. This creates an impossible situation. Intelligence services must demand absolute loyalty to function, but they must also recognize that absolute loyalty can enable catastrophe. There is no solution to this dilemma, only awareness of its existence. Conclusion: the invisible victory. Yoshikawa Mitsusaburo died in November 1992 at age 82. His funeral was attended by family and former colleagues. None knew that he had helped end the Pacific War. The truth emerged 3 years after his death. By then, most of the people whose lives he saved had no idea they owed him anything. American veterans who didn't die invading Japan never knew Yoshikawa's name. Japanese civilians who weren't killed in the invasion never heard his story. The millions who survived because the war ended in August rather than November remained unaware of his contribution. His son described learning about his father's espionage from the newspaper. I read the article 3 times before I could believe it. My father, who never spoke about the war, who seemed like an ordinary bureaucrat, had been a spy, had risked his life, had changed history, and never told anyone, not even his family. The revelation forced the family to re-evaluate their understanding of Yoshikawa, his withdrawn personality in the years after the war, his insomnia and anxiety, his refusal to discuss anything related to his foreign ministry work. All of it made sense in retrospect. His wife, who had known the truth since 1945, finally spoke about those months. He was terrified every single day. He understood that one mistake would mean death for both of us, but he believed it was necessary. He would say, "I can live with fear. I cannot live with knowing I could have stopped this and didn't." She described the day Japan surrendered. He came home and couldn't speak. He just sat at the table crying. I asked if he was sad or happy. He said, "Both. The war is over, but I am a traitor." I told him, "You saved Japan from itself. That is not treason." He said, "History will decide that. I hope I'm dead when it does." He was right to hope. The debate about his legacy continues. This is perhaps fitting. The greatest intelligence successes are often invisible. The catastrophes prevented rather than battles won. the casualties avoided rather than enemies destroyed. How do you commemorate victories that consist of things not happening? How do you celebrate the invasion that never occurred? How do you honor the deaths that didn't happen? Yoshikawa's legacy is measured in negative space. The battles never fought, the bombs never dropped, the casualties never incurred. Every American soldier who didn't die on Japanese beaches in November 1945, every Japanese civilian who didn't die defending those beaches, every child born because parents survived, every life lived because the war ended when it did. The number is incalculable, but it's measured in millions. Yoshikawa saved those lives by betraying his government. His treason was patriotism. His espionage was heroism. His betrayal was loyalty to something larger than government. The moral ambiguity remains uncomfortable. Yoshikawa violated his oath. He betrayed the trust placed in him. He committed capital treason under Japanese law, but his treason saved his country. His betrayal prevented catastrophe. His espionage ended a war. Was he justified? From any utilitarian perspective, obviously yes. From any deontological perspective, arguably no. From any virtue ethics perspective, ambiguously both. The ethical frameworks disagree. This suggests the question transcends simple moral calculus. Perhaps the answer is that some situations cannot be resolved through obedience to rules. Some circumstances require violating every rule to achieve the right outcome. Some moments demand betrayal as the highest form of loyalty. Yoshikawa lived in such a moment. His government was committing national suicide. His country was being led to extinction. His leaders refused to acknowledge reality. He had information that could change this trajectory. He had access to intelligence that could end the war. He had the ability to betray his government to save his country. He made a choice. He chose treason. He chose betrayal. He chose to violate every oath he had sworn. And he saved millions of lives. The spy who betrayed Japan saved Japan. The traitor who violated his oath kept a higher faith. The man who committed treason performed the greatest act of patriotism in Japanese history. His name remained secret for 50 years. His contribution was unrecognized during his lifetime. His heroism was invisible to everyone except Soviet intelligence officers and a few historians. But invisibility doesn't diminish impact. The invasion that never happened was as important as any battle fought. The casualties prevented were as significant as any enemies defeated. The war ended in August instead of November because Yoshikawa betrayed his government. This is the paradox of intelligence work. The greatest successes are those nobody knows about. The most important victories are those that consist of disasters prevented. The highest form of service is sometimes the deepest form of betrayal. Yoshikawa Mitsusaburo understood this. He paid the psychological cost. He lived with the burden of secrecy for 47 years. He died without recognition. But he died knowing he had saved millions of lives. He died knowing his betrayal had ended a war. He died knowing his treason had been the highest form of patriotism. That knowledge was his reward. It had to be enough, because for decades it was all he had. The spy who betrayed Japan saved Japan. The traitor ended the Pacific War. The man nobody knew changed history, one dead drop at a time, one memorized document at a time, one act of treason at a time, until peace, invisible, secret, and decisive, just as he intended.